Hello and welcome to this video on short-run aggregate supply. In this video today, we're going to look at what is meant by aggregate supply, be able to describe a movement along or a shift in the aggregate supply curve, and finally look at the factors that influence the short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's start off with what is meant by aggregate supply. Well, aggregate supply is the quantity of goods and services that producers, so the firms or businesses within an economy, are willing and able to supply at a given price level. So it's kind of how much they plan to produce given the price level in the economy. The short-run aggregate supply is the relationship between planned national output, what firms and businesses plan to produce, and the general price level over a short period of time. And the aggregate supply curve shows us this relationship, sometimes known as the AS curve. Now the axes here are the same as for our aggregate demand curve. So again, we're looking within our economy at the general price level on the y-axis and the level of output, real GDP, on the x-axis. And the AS curve looks like this. So it is upward sloping as opposed to our aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. And what, I hear you cry, are the reasons for this? Well, why is the AS curve upward sloping? Well, there are three main reasons. The first one is that the AS curve represents all the supply curves of firms across the economy added together. So we take the supply curve of all the firms in the petrol industry, and we add it to the supply curve of all the firms in the food industry, and we add it to the supply curve of all the firms in the sportswear industry. If we add it across all the industries in the economy, because they're all upward, supply is an upward sloping curve, in aggregate across the economy, AS would be upward sloping and showing us the relationship between the price level across the whole economy and output across the whole economy, real GDP. The second reason is that if firms increase output, if they produce more, in order to do that, they might have to pay more for overtime or for faster delivery of raw materials, which in turn will push up their prices because their costs are higher. So as they produce more, we might expect the prices of products to rise. The final reason is that the other way around, high prices for goods and services make output more profitable and enable businesses to expand production. So if prices are quite high, there is an incentive here for businesses to expand. Also, if prices are high, they can make more profit, which enables them to produce more output. So we'd expect low levels of price or low price levels associated with lower levels of planned output, higher price levels associated with higher levels of planned output. Hence, we have a slope like this. Okay, so we've looked at what is meant by supply curve. Let's move on to movements along. So here is our AS curve, and currently in our economy, we're imagining that the price level here is at general price level 1, and that would lead to a planned level of output of Y1. Now, what would happen if the level of prices in the economy rose, if there was inflation, and price level rose to price level 2? Well, what the AS curve tells us is how much businesses would plan to produce. And if the price level rose, the firms within our economy would plan to produce more. They would plan to produce Y2 level of GDP. So that would be an expansion of aggregate supply. A rise in the price level would cause an expansion of aggregate supply, a movement along the curve. Let's imagine actually there was deflation and the price level fell. In that scenario, we would have an opposite effect. We would have a contraction of aggregate supply as at a lower price level, firms within the economy, producers within the economy would plan to produce a lower level of output. So we would call this a contraction of aggregate supply. So a quick reminder, changes in the price level cause movements along the AS curve. But what else might affect the level of aggregate supply, and what might cause a change in the willingness of firms to supply a given price level? In other words, what might cause shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve? Well, there are three broad categories, and all of these might affect businesses. So the first one is changes in resources or resource prices, the inputs that businesses use to produce. So if the wages went up for businesses, that would change the cost of resources and change their willingness to supply a certain quantity at a given price level. It's linked to labour productivity, so output per worker. Lower levels of labour productivity will presumably mean a less output willing to be supplied at a certain price level. The raw materials and component prices, such as glass, cement, rubber, energy costs, such as oil, gas, electricity, all of these costs would have an impact on the price level at which firms are willing to supply. Another broad category might be outside influences like business taxes from the government or subsidies from the government. So that's money given to firms. That would probably lower the price level at which they were willing to supply a certain quantity. Regulations, the cost of imported materials, which would of course be affected by the exchange rate and what's happening to the prices of commodities like oil, gas, rubber, and so on. The last one, a supply shock, so for example, a hurricane or a tsunami, might affect how much a country can produce. So that might reduce the aggregate supply curve. So let's have a little look at an example here. If we imagine this is our aggregate supply curve, if there was a decrease in aggregate supply, we would illustrate that by shifting the aggregate supply curve to the left. And what might have caused this may have been a rise in raw material prices, perhaps a rise in energy costs or unit labour costs, an increase in the cost of regulations. And effectively what it's doing is saying that businesses would not be prepared to supply that particular quantity at a certain price level. So here, on the original aggregate supply curve, we're saying within the economy, firms would have been willing to supply level Y2 of output if the price level was this price level here. But actually, if there is a rise in energy costs and a rise in raw material prices, what we're saying is they probably wouldn't be willing to supply Y2 at this price level. They're probably only willing to supply Y2 at a higher price level. So effectively, all these points here have moved up and our curve has shifted to the left. So the broad approach would be to say all these effects here mean that firms would be less willing to supply a given quantity at a certain price level, so supply would shift to the left. Let's have a look at another example here. What might cause a shift out in supply? So we start off with AS curve. A shift would be illustrated like this. And this might have been caused by perhaps a rise in labour productivity or perhaps a decline in energy costs. So what we see is that at a given price level, firms were willing originally to supply Y1, but if their workers are more productive or perhaps energy costs are cheaper, that at this price level, they're actually willing to supply more, up to Y3. A different way of looking at it is that they would only have supplied Y3 originally if the price level had been up here. But now their workers are more productive and energy costs have decreased. They're actually willing to supply Y3 at this price level here. So again, we see a movement to the right, an increase in demand if what's happening would encourage businesses to produce more. Sorry, an increase in supply. So to wrap up, what might be external factors influencing the short-run aggregate supply curve? Well, oil and gas prices would be particularly relevant for the UK as we're a net importer of energy. Energy prices and costs, so things like coal, other minerals or materials, perhaps foodstuffs, so coffee, wheat, sugar, all those kind of things. And tariffs and quotas. Currently, the UK is a member of the European Union, but if they were to leave the single market, there might be quotas or tariffs imposed, which would have an impact on the costs to business and therefore their willingness to supply at a certain price level. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by aggregate supply. We've looked at movements along versus shift in the aggregate supply curve, and finally looked at some factors that influence the short run aggregate supply curve. That's it. Thank you very much.